So when we go see the Dalai Lama, for instance, he's going to tell us, you know, compassion is the way, and openness, and we already believe that. I'm not saying that it's not true, but we don't know until we experiment, right? We don't know until we use this in our life and see if it works for us. We don't need to accept it because the Dalai Lama says it, or I say it, or anybody else. So this, what Daizong says here about not knowing is closest to it, or not knowing is most intimate, is a really interesting thing. Can we really do it? Can we really go through life and be willing to have the courage to enter into situations without knowing? Without knowing what? Well, without knowing who I am. Do I have to know who I am to enter into a relationship? No. Do I have to know who you are to enter into a relationship? If I know who you are beforehand, how am I going to experience who you are today? You might be different. You might have changed overnight, or from last week, or from last month, or whenever I saw you. How am I going to experience who you are today if I come in with an idea of who you are? Obviously, I will not. Obviously, if that happens, I will most likely carry my idea forward, and it'll influence my experience of who you are now. I'll think, this is the same person that was sitting in front of me yesterday. How do I know that? Well, they have the same name. We have this thing called facial recognition that from a very early age we learn how to recognize familiar faces. But are you the same person you were yesterday, or last year, or last week? I think if we, again, examine this closely, we'll see we're not. Not the same person I was 6 months ago or a year ago. So if someone that hasn't seen me in a year comes around and they have an idea that I'm the same as I was then, that's going to flavor, that's going to color their experience of the current moment reality. They may not see. We may not see the current reality clearly because of this idea. So say we have a feeling that we need to do something. We may not know exactly why we're doing it, but can we trust that not knowing? It takes us an unusual person to trust that not knowing. To trust not intellectually knowing. It may not even make intellectual sense. It may not even make intellectual sense. And yet, and other people may tell us, you're not making any sense. You shouldn't do this. Do we accept that authority? Do we accept their viewpoint? Or if the priest or the rabbi or the book that was written thousands of years ago says do not do it? Maybe. I'm not saying one way or the other, but let's see. Let's see what works. So often we keep using things in our life that do not work just because we're used to doing them or because someone else has told us we need to do them that way. So often. One of the amazing things that I notice about the Zen dialogue process, which we did in a workshop yesterday, is how creative the ego is in disguising why it's doing things. Very creative. We all have very creative egos, by the way, in case you haven't noticed that. But creative in not that beneficial of a way to us in many cases. You know, if we can turn that ego's creativity from destructive internal behaviors to creative behaviors, it can be quite a difference, I'm sure. So the ego, when we do the dialogue process, and we ask the ego mind, as part of this workshop, well, what is your purpose for the self? And inevitably, the ego will say, well, one of my purposes is to keep the self safe, to protect the self. And hopefully that's true, because if our ego self is not protecting us, and you see this in the cases of people who have ego selves that are not fully developed, right, in some form or another, they aren't good at protecting themselves, and so they get hurt a lot. They become victims. They allow themselves on some level to become victims much of the time. So this ego self, under the guise of protection and security and keeping us safe, does all these things which, guess what, often have the opposite effect. So we'll hold that tension in our heart because we feel that it is protecting us on some level, but is it? Does holding tension in the body protect us in any way? Well, no. In fact, and again, this is just physiological reality. Tension in the body creates anxiety, creates disease, creates all kinds of problems. It's easy to observe, right? You don't have to believe anything in particular to understand that tension in the body doesn't actually protect us. Does it help us defend ourselves better? No. And again, this is directly observable. If you've ever been involved in martial arts or boxing or any sports, you know that the more tension in your body, the more you're slowed down. You can't move quicker, you move slower because of the tension. A loose body means quicker movement, quicker reaction times. So again, objectively observable. And yet, on some level, we believe that we do need to hold these things. We do need to hold these patterns in the body because we feel in some form or another it's protecting us. This is not practicing not knowing. This is practicing knowing. This is practicing thinking we know that this is what will protect us. But it's normally on an unconscious level, of course. So to really do the pilgrimage and not know for sure, to be able to live our life and not know why we're even doing it, do we have to know why this is all here and why it's the way it is in order to live effectively? Do we have to? Why? Why do we have to know intellectually? What is it about intellectual knowing that is required here? Can't we just live? We know we're alive. We do know that, right? Again, directly observable. Because you can see when people aren't. They behave in very different ways, or they don't behave at all. They just lie there. They're dead, right? Bodies get cold. So we do know we're alive. That's one thing we know. Or I should say we can experience that fact. We don't even have to intellectually know it. We can just experience that aliveness. So what is required to move forward then? Others' opinions about what we should be doing? Ideas that we've gotten from school or from books? Do those really help us? Now, yeah, if we want to fix a car, they do. If we want to pave the street or prune trees or whatever, we may need that kind of information. It might help us. But in this experience of life, don't they often just get in the way, all these ideas? Now, it sounds easy to say, just drop all that knowing and just embrace not knowing, because that's closest to it. That's closest to what? What is it closest to? Well, the experience is more clear the less we think we know, right? That's what he's saying. So when we feel like it's time to go on pilgrimage, we just go on pilgrimage. We may not know. And it may be revealed to us as time goes on. This has happened to me many times when I've been able to drop what I know and just move into things. Somehow, it reveals itself later. I can look back and say, oh, but to be able to drop the knowing, well, the ego is not very comfortable with that. It's very, very difficult to live this way if we're going to cling to having to know. Now, you can read books on Zen, and you can go to workshops and seminars that'll reinforce probably what you already believe on some level or another, because probably what will happen is what usually happens when we go to those kind of